opportunity to take that 1 minute. We have a lot to cover tonight. I'm going to be moving pretty quickly, partly because I'm behind. A big reason because I'm behind. I talked too much last time and got behind on chapter 2. So I've rearranged the material for the rest of chapter 2 and chapter 3 in order to try to get finished with it tonight. And I've done it. I'm going to do something a little bit differently in these next 3 slides, and I'll let you know what that is in just a minute. It's nothing embarrassing, don't worry. I know how it is when teachers say, I'm going to do something a little different tonight. You, I do anyway. When they start wanting you to get off in groups and stuff, I don't like that. So anyway, this first slide, I wanted to just come back to the beginning and remind us of the overall outline, at least the way I put it together, so we can kind of have that in our minds tonight as we look through chapters 2 and 3.
What book are we in?
Oh, I'm sorry, we're in Titus. I'm moving so quickly that I failed to let our visitors know where we were. You guys are new from Sunday morning. So we're wrapping up the letter of Titus. This is a short segment for us at the end of the year. We have a few sort of leftover sessions, and so this year we decided to use this time to hit some of the short letters that so often don't get taught just because of their brevity. So we'll be in chapters 2 and 3 of Titus. Thank you for letting me know, asking that. So the way I put the outline together was in chapter 1 through 4, introduction of the writer and the recipient, very typical way that Paul usually starts his letters. Verses 5 through 16, the rest of chapter 1, he jumps right into a very pressing matter that he has that he wants to Titus to deal with in the church at Crete, where Titus is, which has to do with some people who are talking a whole lot and not saying a whole lot, leading a lot of people away from what they should be doing. And so he tells Titus that he wants him to appoint elders, and he also wants him to rebuke these people very sharply. Chapter 2, then, he begins by talking about what sound doctrine is, or wanting the people to return to sound doctrine. And then he immediately begins a section where he teaches some very specific teaching to different classes of individuals, older men, older women, younger men, and so forth, in those first 10 verses. And then the last half of the chapter, 11 through 15, he basically is saying, now I've told you all these things, these are the ways I want you to live. Now this is the reason why you should live that way. And chapter 3 is very similar, except the first couple of verses are really more general teaching on how Christians should live with one another, as well as in the community outside of the church. And then again, in 3 through 8, he gives them reasons why they should act that way. And then finally, in 9 through 11, some general teachings on what not to do, how not to live. And then finally, at the end, his salutations to the people that he is writing to. So what I want to do on these next 3 slides is, and that was on purpose there, that is, I changed this, I talked about this on Sunday morning. Sound doctrine is what I used to have on these slides, and I've changed that to looks like. I think that's more representative of what sound doctrine, what he's really saying here in this section. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put up the characteristics, the attitudes, the behaviors that Paul talked about to Titus about older men and older women. I'm not going to go through these myself one at a time in any particular order. I want to ask you, if you want to just pick any one you want off this. If you have one that you want to talk about, you want to discuss, you want to give the definition and so forth, just pick any one you want, and we'll spend 5 minutes on this slide and hit as many of them as we can. So don't worry about any particular sequence or anything like that. If there's one on here that you want to talk to, just raise your hand and call on you, and we'll do it that way. And we'll spend 5 minutes on this slide, the next one, and the next one. We already talked about sober-minded and self-controlled on Sunday morning, but feel free to jump in and add to that if you want to, or redo it. So as you're defining this, as you're doing this, maybe one suggestion would be that you try to define the term as best you can. As we said on Sunday morning, there's a lot of overlap in these definitions, these different characteristics. And then maybe think about why Paul might have used these particular terms for these particular classes of individuals. Some of these are only applied to one particular class. Some of them these terms are applied to a number of them. And there may not be any reasons behind it, but then again, there might be reasons why he would apply certain characteristics to certain groups and not others. All right, now.
I would say in general, when we talk about this on Sunday morning, we have different roles, obviously, men and women in the Lord's church. And while we're equals in terms of our salvation, our roles are different. And I believe that a lot of the comments made in these sections are specifically addressed to men and women, depending on our tendencies, good and bad, that we might have. And it's kind of that reminder of, the differences, not only in our roles, but also in typically our behavior, not always, but typically in our behavior and the roles we find ourselves in. So I think that's why he specifically addresses certain things to men and certain to women.
Okay, very good. Ralph?
I like that you put looks in your heading there, because it's kind of saying, reminding you of who's looking at you and your behavior. And it's important because it influences the people who are looking up to you, especially for these older men and these older women. It's so essential that our older women teach our younger women. The men, all these characteristics, they tell you to be measured, to measure what you do, how you act, and really we know to measure it against the standard of God. But we know, as we were younger men and as we're getting older, we're looking up to those, same with the women, to see what sound doctrine looks like, to see what a life of faith looks like. Because whether we realize it or not, we're going to imitate that. And when we get older, whether we realize it or not, younger people are going to imitate us. We want them to be imitating Christ.
Right. And it's not just the people within the church that sees us. People outside the church see these behaviors in us as well. And they're going to be taught a whole lot more, at least from the standpoint of what they are going to see more often than we're ever going to have an opportunity to sit down and have a formal class with the majority of the people that we come in contact with. So our behavior is our best and first opportunity to influence people, so that we will have a better opportunity to perhaps set up a more formal study situation with someone.
If we want to start defining some of the characteristics, we can start faith, love, and steadfast. Faith is obedient belief, so that's knowing your scripture, knowing the word, practicing it. That's what it sounds like.
All right. Anybody else? Got about one more minute on this slide that we can allot to it if you have comments. We don't have to spend 5 minutes on every one, but if we have comments, we have that time. Did you have?
Well, when I hear about sound doctrine, I hear about what God is telling us. This is not a man-made thing.
Right, exactly.
This is God revealing His righteousness to us. So we have to understand that His righteousness is not our own, it's His. And we have to attain to that. So when I think of sound doctrine, that's what kind of crosses my mind.
Right, and and that was partly what I was trying to clarify on Sunday morning. And I know you were here, you're not contradicting anything I said, but I had said in the last time I taught this 4 years ago, and then had alluded to it on last Wednesday night, that sound doctrine is, and that's all I had at the top of these slides. Sound doctrine is these behaviors. And as I thought about that, that's not really true. Sound doctrine, as you just said, is what God has told us it is. It is the body of truth that God has given us. Then we emulate that. We reflect that in these behaviors. So this is how we can show others what sound doctrine looks like, by acting these ways that God has told us to act. Marty.
I mean, I referenced it on Sunday, but I'll kind of say it again, verse 10. I mean, looking at this in the mirror of the false teachers, that they're what they're being called to do. There are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers, and deceivers. They must be silenced. And then going down to verse 13, therefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith. You're going to stand up and stop the false teachers. You gotta look like that.
Right. That's right. All right, I've moved to the next slide now. So we're looking at the list that Paul gave for younger women and younger men now. Again, some of these are the same terms, like self-controlled is used multiple times throughout these classes, but others are different. So pick out something here if you want to, and talk about it. Why do you think it's in a particular list and not in others? Why do you think it applies to one particular class or certain classes and not others? Or what does the term itself mean? And why is it important as a Christian to look like that? Pressure, pressure. I'm going to have the Jeopardy music going here in a minute. Well, let's pick a hard one here. Let's pick a controversial one here. Working at home. How does that apply? Go ahead.
Well, I think it's skills, right? I mean, we all have toilets. They need to be cleaned, whether you pay someone to clean them or you clean them yourself. It has to happen. Why do I always talk about weird things? But I think it's important that the younger women are taught how to manage their home, however that happens. You know, there needs to be some sort of order in the home, and it's important that they know it's a skill, and so, you know, those are skills. And then the loving their husbands and children. You know, we want to think love is that fuzzy feeling. You know, when we're young, I know I did that a lot. Like, I thought, oh, this is so great, and then the babies are so cute, but it gets really hard. And so when someone with more experience is that, you know, sometimes your husband is gonna, you know, not be so lovable. Your kids are gonna be really gross. You know, and you're still gonna have to take care of them. It's important. All of that, the working home and the living.
Marty?
And I'll add to that, I mean, we talk about this often, you know, in your younger days, you don't see that these are important roles. At 40 years old, we can look back and know that those days that you were raising those children, in hindsight, it looks important now. But in the midst of that, when you're cleaning up the mess and fighting with kids and all of that, it just feels like a struggle, and you just feel like your life is not meaning anything or doing anything, and it's just the drudgery of it. But it's important. It's important for young men and young women to be raising up their children in godly ways, and the working on home and all that stuff. And I think it's important that I hate to overuse it. It sounds a little denominational to say to celebrate that, but we need to reach out to these younger men and women with their first kids and say, hey, what you are doing right now is important. What you're doing right now, even though it feels like drudgery, you're performing a critical role that probably is the most important thing you'll ever do in your life, and you're doing it right now.
Exactly. I've heard Benita say so many times that for so many years while we were raising our kids, she never really got to sit through a service and hear the sermon, not in any kind of consistency or continuity way. You hear parts of it, of course. And there's so many in here that can sympathize with that, of course, because you've had kids, some very close together, some more than us. We had ours very close together and made it difficult, made it maybe more challenging than if they were spread out. But the point is the same as you're making. It's still important. You may not be able to do the same things, to be able to participate in the worship in the classes in the same way you were, but you're still performing very, very important duty as well as privilege and honor to do those things and how you raise your kids. So, anything else on this slide? So much more we could get out of these. I know that. We're moving very, very quickly, but we just have to. We're on a hard deadline. Ralph?
In the high school young adult class, we were studying Timothy and the qualifications for eldership. And if we're ever going to have elders, young women and young men need to be like this. And we talked about when do you start to aspire to become an elder? When you're these people. So when you're older people, you'll have those qualifications.
Right. And that goes back to the point that we made in the last Wednesday night when we ran past very quickly the eldership qualifications, because that wasn't in the scope of this class to hit those in any kind of detail. But all but two of them would apply to any Christian, male or female, of any class. Those are the characteristics of a Christian that we should all be aspiring to. So that's the same thing. So I'm going to move to the next slide. Maybe this won't take quite as long, but it's important nevertheless. We don't have bond servants in the formal sense, in the same sense that the cultures of this day that Paul was writing in and the people that he was writing to do. But some of the relationships that we have in our society are similar, and therefore we have to look at these characteristics of bond servants and apply them where they are applicable to our own lives. So any comments about bond servants and some of these characteristics, why they're here, what may have been some of the problems that culture was having with their master bond servant relationships and so forth.
This says bond servants, but if you, same thing would apply for people you're working for. Every one of those things, every one of those characteristics, you have to be conscious of when you're working for somebody else.
That's exactly right. I agree with that. I have another slide. I may have hidden it for time's sake, but that was one of the points that I would have made here and talked about was that, and that I alluded to a moment ago, is that we still have these types of relationships. We're not bond servants in the same way. We're working for a wage. We're not slaves the way they were in their day. But if we understand the nature of authority, which we should as members of the Lord's body, then we understand that in different relationships in our lives, especially in those relationships like employer-employee relationships, that some people have authority over us. And it's our responsibility to adhere to succumb to their authority, even when it's very, very difficult. And I talk to myself, I point the finger at myself when I say that. In the last few years of my career, I had a hard time with that. And I didn't always adhere to and succumb to the authorities that were over me like I should have, because sometimes it's just difficult.
Well, at my age, I'm working for people that are much younger than I am. But you still have to be conscious.
That's right. You still have to be conscious of these things. All right. Yes.
I love the way the English Standard says, so that in everything they may adorn the doctrine of God or something.
Right. So I do still have this this slide in here. So these were some of the points that you've already kind of made here, and so these are some of the relationships we have in our lives right here, where submissiveness, where not being argumentative and quarreling and those kinds of things come into play, where we all have to answer to somebody. And notice I have husbands to wives and wives to husbands, not just wives to husbands. There's submission both ways. There's submission within a church. We're all supposed to submit to one another in different ways. We're supposed to submit to our governments, so forth. All right. So at the end of Titus chapter 2, after Paul has given these characteristics of these toward these specific groups of people, then he comes back and says, this is why. Why should we live like this? So in 11 through 15 of chapter 2, let me just read this very quickly. This is from the English Standard Version, I believe. For the grace of God has, and this is the reasons, for or because the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. That's the why that all these classes of individuals should act the way he just described. And then he tells Titus, declare these things, exhort and rebuke with all authority. Let no one disregard you. So I don't have a whole lot of comments about that. I think those are pretty self-evident. Of course, we could spend a lot more time on that and glean a lot out of all those different words and all those different descriptions there. But at a high level, this is the reason why we should act this way, because God has done all these things for us. I put this was in the original outline when we expanded some of the high level points, and in the 11:15, this was the reason, because God did these things, all these verbs. He appeared, he saved, he trained, he gave himself, he redeemed, and he purified us. These are the reasons. It's a response to God's actions that we should be acting these ways. All right, any comments on anything we've said tonight, chapter 2, and so forth? Go ahead. Ralph?
So in all those characteristics, there's no qualifiers. So in our society, we tend to have qualifiers on everything. I'll be like this as long as you're like, if you're like this, then I'll be like that. And none of those are laid out that way. We're expected to be that way, like Les said, regardless of
Right.
the people in those roles that we need to submit to.
Right. We're told to be, the bondservants in another place in the scriptures are told to submit even to the froward master, which is, I guess, is kind of an old-fashioned King James word for, a crummy manager, a crummy master. So even when we have those managers, those people above us that we don't think do a very good job and don't like the way they treat us, we still have an obligation to submit to them in what they want us to do. So then we move on to chapter 3. And again, as we saw in the outline, the reason I wanted to put it before us again is to see that the format is very similar again. He goes back to teaching in the first two verses, where he says, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work. to speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to be gentle, and to show perfect courtesy toward all people. Boy, there's one phrase in there that just stood out to me, that hit me, and I bet nobody in here could probably say that they've never been guilty of this. Speak evil of no one. Boy, that's hard. That's a tough one. That wasn't a point that I was wanting to make necessarily, but it just kind of stood out to me how difficult that would be. But all of these are just things that, and remember, notice that these are more general teachings. Instead of being focused on specific classes and groups like the section in chapter 2 was, this is more general, and it's more toward the community at large, and not just toward one another, because it's talking about submitting to rulers and authorities, to avoid quarreling, and at the very end, courtesy toward all people. So this is more of a broad way that we should be acting out in our society with others. Now, one of the things that he says here is he talks about good work. So I have a slide here that shows all the different places in this short letter where Paul talks about good works. And we made the point early on, and for time's sake, we haven't really kind of gone through and looked at the number of times that certain words are listed in this letter. But a large number of these different phrases and so forth are repeated throughout. So anytime a writer does that, then obviously that's something that's on his mind for some reason and is very important to him. And good works are listed 6 times in this letter. We see in chapter 1 when he was talking about these know-it-alls, that they are unfit for any good work. In chapter 2, in the section for young men, he says young men are to be a model of good works. And we're all to be zealous for good works. And we're to be ready for good works, devoted to good works, and to learn how to be devoted to good works. So if we go back and think about our original main theme of this letter. Now, I had a main theme. You may not necessarily agree with that particular theme. I called it a guide to Christian living. There's other ways we could word the theme of this book, but thinking about your overall theme for this book, how does this, the fact that he uses the term good work so many times fit into that overall theme? How does it apply? Why, how do those two things correlate with one another?
Words, and if you're going to be fitting yourself to good works, fitting yourself to what we're told to do, then you should be committing yourself to good works both within the church family and outside the church family as well. Because that's, it gets back to the point of setting a good example and having people say, well, why do you live this way? Why do you make these decisions? Why do you choose to do this way? And that's your opportunity to say to somebody, it's because, I'm a Christian. I follow what we've been instructed to do. So that's how it ties together for me.
Okay.
What always comes to my mind when we're talking about good works, Ephesians 2:10, created in Christ Jesus for good works. I think that's twofold. The way I look at that, it's keeping the law plus those good works that he has created us in him to do. What we do here on Sunday morning and the other good things that he wants us to do, what we've already been talking about, in this lesson so far. But yeah, every time I see good works, I always think back to Ephesians 2:10, created in Christ Jesus for good works.
All right. Jared? Come on, man. What's wrong? Go ahead.
So I mean, I read something like this and I don't understand how anybody could ever think that, Paul and James didn't agree or weren't in unison or weren't in harmony. This is exactly what James is saying in his letter. And it's, I mean, like, and to Dale's point, it's really all through Paul's writings as well, but you get focused on a certain thing and filter everything through that. And they
Right.
get blind to it.
So the point that you're making, of course, is that the reason that so many people think that James is in contradiction with the writings of Paul is that James talks about good works, but they're filtering it, as you just stated, they're filtering it through this idea of grace is the only thing that saves us without any works on our part. All right? There's a sense in which everything I just said is true. All right? We got to be really, really careful the way we state it as well. Grace is what saves us. We do not do anything to earn our salvation. That's the key terms right there that we have to get in there. We understand that, even though we're accused of not understanding that. That we don't believe that these works we're talking about is in any way earning our salvation, but they are still things that we're told to do within the Scriptures. Some of those things are related to acts like baptism, but that's not all of them. That's not everything that James was talking about, for instance. In fact, that's probably one of the last things he actually had in his mind in the middle of chapter 2 of James when he was talking about works, because his examples have more to do with taking care of the brother in need and not just telling him, go, be ye warmed and filled. Now, does it apply to those other things? Yeah, I believe it does, but again, that wasn't the primary context that James had.
We'll look at the context of what James is talking about there. He's using Abraham. Abraham's following what God told him to do. Here we have God telling us to do these things, these good works. I mean, and that's what Abraham was doing. He was following God's, instructions to do these certain things. So what does faith look like? It doesn't look like something that's dead. It's got to be doing something, and it's got to be doing what God has asked us to do, not just anything we want to go do. So that when in the denominational world, they think anything do God's going to credit them as righteous, and that's not the way God works. In other words, you just can't go out and have a class to teach somebody something, within that church organization. And, I've seen it on marquees, yoga classes, within a denominational church. It's like, why are they doing that? It's their own creation of what they think is righteousness. And
Right.
It's not going to happen.
I see. Go ahead. I was waiting for you to let me know.
Okay, well,
Go ahead.
I think families were basically given to us as a construction to understand spiritual truth. I think one of the things that all of us can probably agree on is listening to our children fight about the very stupidest stuff in the world. This afternoon, one of my children was fighting over whether it was the Goodwills or Goodwill, and where they were going this afternoon. And you just sit there thinking, it doesn't make any difference either way, whichever way you want to go with that. And I think one of the things that Paul is telling these people is treat each other nice, be nice to each other, be good to each other. Because here's the thing: you're going to be persecuted everywhere, and people under persecution either fold and quit, or they get stronger. And the way they get stronger is be nice to each other. Yeah. Be nice.
Nice segue. Thank you for that nice segue. So I just moved the slide while he was talking because the next point is basically what he was just saying. Another set of terms or a phrase that is used a number of times in this letter are terms like gentle and kind. You can see again 6 times. I'm not going to read them all, but they're applied to all Christians and young women, and courtesy toward all people, and so forth. So I can ask the same question and see if you want to answer. How does gentle and kind play into the overall theme of this letter and what Paul is trying to get across to Titus so that he can get across to the church at Crete? Why is gentle and kind so important to Christians, to the Christian life, and sound doctrine? I know it's hard because it's really the same correlation as what we just talked about. Nobody wants to just repeat it. So it's almost a trick question, but it's really not. It's just a different way of describing. I mean, being gentle and kind in some ways could be included in the concept of good works. They're not exactly the same thing. Being kind is not necessarily a work, but nevertheless, it's still putting forth the type of face that we want people to see, that we hope looks like Christ. We know that if we emulate Christ and the way he interacted with people, almost everyone that he interacted with, he treated them in this way, gentle and kind. There were only a few situations where there were certain people that just needed to be talked to a bit more harshly, that he handled them in a different way.
And the only time he argued was when he was trying to make someone else better. He didn't argue with Romans. He argued with Pharisees because they should have known better, and he was trying to make them better. I think one of the things that Titus says, Paul says to Titus is, don't be argumentative. Don't go off to pick a fight. But if you're trying to make somebody better, there are times we've all had fights that we wish we could avoid, but we know we need to fight. And we all have fights that we know that would be the stupidest thing. I could win the argument and lose the war. And that's not a fight that you want to have.
That's especially true in husband-wife relationships, isn't it?
I wasn't going to say that. Right?
That's probably the highest on the list in that way, where you hopefully, as we get older and more mature in our relationships and in our marriages, that we start learning when to be quiet and not carry forth an argument, not start an argument, and because it's just not worth it. It's not our little preferences or whatever it is that causes our spouse to get under our skin. It's just not really that important when it boils right down to it. And I think that most marriages get to that point to where people understand that. We hope that's the case. Younger marriages always have more problems with that because they're learning that they're getting used to being a couple and not just being individuals. So we have about 6 more minutes. Any other comments on gentle and kind or any of the other things we've talked about? So this may be too small. Yeah, you could probably read that in most of the things, but I'm going to read this because this is another one of these sections where Paul gives the why. He only spent a short space there. We call it 2 verses where he talked about how these people should be living within the community at large. But there's a reason again, and this is important, and that we read this at least. And if there's pieces that we want to look at this and talk about in the time we have left, we'll do that. So Titus 3, starting with verse 3. For we ourselves were once foolish. So remember, you should act like this within the community at large because we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions and pleasures, passing our days in malice and envy, hated by others and hating one another. But when the goodness and loving kindness of God our Savior appeared, He saved us, not because of works done by us, the point we made a minute ago, in righteousness, but according to His own mercy, by the washing of regeneration and renewal of the Holy Spirit, whom He poured out on us richly through Jesus Christ our Savior, so that, being justified by His grace, we might become heirs according to the hope of eternal life. The saying is trustworthy, and I want you to insist on these things so that those who have believed in God may be careful to devote themselves to good works. These things are excellent and profitable for people. Very eloquent section there where Paul describes to these individuals again, because in some ways it's repeating in a different way what he told us in what he told them in chapter 2, that this is the reason. It's because of what God has done for us. We were just like them. So we should be able to sympathize with these people out in the community that we're living in. That even though they act the way they do, and they're not necessarily like us, we were once like them. Foolish, led away, slaves to our passions and pleasures, and so forth. So we should be able to be more sympathetic to them, and therefore have more incentive for us to try to teach them so that they can receive the same blessings that we have, being justified by His grace, His mercy, becoming heirs, and so forth. So comments or questions on that section there? There's so much I know that we could get out of that, but we just don't have a lot of time. But I do want to, if you have comment to make on any of those terms, any of those concepts there, please feel free before we finish up here. So then he returns back to some of the warnings. He has a short section here, about 3 verses of here's some things not to do. He just spoke in the positive. Here's the things that you should be doing. Here are some things you should not be doing. And this returns back to these know-it-alls who are talking too much, that are these empty talkers and so forth, who are doing some of these things. So he returns to some of those same topics. Verse 9, but avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. As for the person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him, knowing that such a person is warped and sinful. He is self-condemned. So again, another stern warning to Titus, directed to Titus, but so that he can relay these kind of ideas and these warnings to these people who are acting this way. Again, we said on Sunday morning, I believe it was, we don't know for certain what these false teachings were that these people were doing. We can take some of the things from that Paul says infer from them what might have been some of the things, especially here when he adds the word genealogies, which he did not say back in chapter 1 when he was describing them. And that was one of the very common things among the Jews, to be talking about genealogies all the time, trying to compare their lineage to others to try to get a one-up, I guess, on somebody else. Well, I'm a direct descendant from Abraham, or I'm a direct descendant from Moses, probably something like that, to try to show that they were more of a Jew than somebody else was or something. So it was just unprofitable. It was worthless, as he says. So I'm going to read quickly while the kids come back in. Again, this summary that I read Sunday morning, and maybe now that we've studied these things, this will make even more sense to it. This is my summary of the letter. If we can agree that the overall theme of the letter is a guide to Christian living, or something akin to that, then what can we come away with as just what that means? This letter paints a very vivid word picture of what a Christian should look like. Let's start by looking at the words or phrases that are used most in the letter. Christians are supposed to adhere to sound doctrine, both in what they believe and teach, but more importantly in how they live their doctrine. What we believe and teach is extremely important, but these become nothing more than empty words if they are not manifested in our actions. Good works are mentioned 6 times in the letter and are directly tied to proper Christian living. Words like gentle and kind are also used 6 times in the letter and add another layer of color to the picture of a Christian that Paul is painting. Being gentle, kind, and courteous to our brothers and toward all men emulates our master. But Christians are also to be self-controlled, a very broad term that encompasses all aspects of our walk with God, because self-control is required every time we choose to do our master's will over our own. Teaching is mentioned 5 times in the letter and should be something that all Christians are doing in one form or another. When you couple these oft-mentioned words and phrases with others like submission, godly, pure, and dignified, we come away with a fully developed picture of the complete Christian. While the letter definitely addresses some specific problems in Crete with a direct and negative approach, it seems that Paul is also addressing them positively by giving instruction on Christian living. If he can get the Christians in Crete who haven't gone astray yet to grasp these positive aspects of the Christian life, he can likely avoid having to deal with them negatively as he is with the false teachers in the church in Crete. So I know this was a very whirlwind coverage of this short letter in these three sessions that we had. Hopefully we got something out of it. I know that a lot more time could be spent and gotten a lot more deep into some of the concepts within this letter. But thank you very much for your kind attention and your participation throughout all 3 of these classes.
Everybody out tonight. The first song tonight will be number 52 in the Black Book, Exalted. Number 52 in the Black Book.
No, before the world stood there some righteous Son of God, sent as David's ageless hands in all the earth. Exalted, seen with blinded eyes, heedless wicked Son of God, worshipped with contempt in blood and mourned upon a cross, exalted, scorned by those who mocked by all the while, the Son of God, born to take my stand, to give me life, the Son of God, exalted, exalted.
Song after the invitation will be Home of the Soul in the Green Book, number 243.
Isaiah 55, verse 1, the prophet said, Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Come to the waters. And when I read that passage, and this came to my mind a number of years ago when I read this passage, I started thinking about a childhood experience. And the childhood experience was that back in the 1960s, we lived in, or prior to the 60s, we lived in Tennessee. We lived in Columbia, Tennessee. And our grandparents and all of our kinfolks lived some ways to the west of there in Dixon, where we were all born. And I remember as a boy, we'd make that trip from Columbia in Murray County over to Dixon in Dixon County. And we would go through the country roads, and I remember going through places like Little Lot. It was a big place, Little Lot. And there was another little place called Bon Aqua. And Bon Aqua means good water. And maybe this is the reason it was called Bon Aqua, I don't know, but there was this place about halfway between our house and our grandparents' house where we would stop and pull over by the side of the road. It was in the hills, those old hills of Middle Tennessee, and real shady area. And we'd pull off the side, and they had made a little place where cars could pull over. And the reason they did is because in the side of this mountain, somebody had at some remote time in the past put a pipe in the side of that mountain, the side of that hill, and it was all rusty. And I always wondered, who put that there and how they knew they would find water when they got it in there. I don't know how they figured all that out, but it had tapped into a natural spring. And so Daddy would always pull the car over there, and it was a real treat for us because this cool, clean spring water was always running out of that old rusty pipe. And we'd always pull over there and get a cup or two and go over there and get some water, or maybe just get it in our hands and drink it. Just a break in the middle of our trip to get some of that cool spring water. And there's nothing like it on a hot summer day. I always think about that, how refreshing that was, and how neat it was. And it was free. It was there. And don't know who put it there, but we took advantage of it. And it has stuck with me through all these years. And it came to my mind years ago when I read this passage where he says, "Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters." Well, this is a great passage. Of course, we know that as far as the context is concerned, the prophet Isaiah is writing to the people of Israel, Judah specifically, and he is saying to them that you have reason to have hope, even though there's going to be this terrible captivity that's going to come. You can have hope because God's going to deliver you, those who want to take advantage of it. So the invitation that's given here to come to the water and accept what I offer to you is in that context. But I think we all recognize very clearly that this also looks forward to the coming of Jesus. This very clearly is a messianic passage. We know that partly because down in verse 3, he talks about the fact that he's going to make an everlasting covenant with his people. He says, according to the faithful mercies shown to David. And you think about the great promise that God, through Nathan the prophet, made to David about someone to come, the Messiah, who is going to sit on his everlasting throne and rule over an everlasting kingdom. And all that's in mind here when he talks about these things. But here's a picture of how God provides for the needs of his people. He provides for our needs. But it makes me realize that there's just certain things that we need. There are certain needs that we have that we try in vain so many times to fill. There's an emptiness, I think. There's a void that so many of us in this old world, we try to fill with all kinds of things. Maybe we try to fill that void with riches. Maybe we try to satisfy that emptiness with what money can buy, whether it's material things or pleasure. Or maybe we try to fill it all with worldly wisdom. People have tried all kinds of things, but it doesn't work. Because we are creatures who have a need that only God himself can fill. In the New Testament, we see very clearly the same imagery that we see in this passage. You remember that Jesus, when he spoke to this Samaritan woman by Jacob's well, and he talked to her about this living water that he could provide. And he said, whoever drinks of the living water that I will give will never thirst again. Or you remember in the 6th chapter of John that Jesus talked about the bread of life. And he said, I'm the bread of life. And he also makes the statement there that whoever eats this bread, whoever drinks the drink that I offer, will never hunger and will never thirst. I mean, that's the gospel, isn't it? And the answers that we often look for in vain, and the satisfaction that we try to find in vain to try to fill our needs, it can only be fulfilled by what the Lord offers. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. I am the water of life, the living water. And you remember that great invitation there in the book of Revelation, right near the end of the book of Revelation, in chapter 22, the Spirit and the bride say, Come. And let the one who hears say, Come. And let the one who is thirsty come. And let the one who wishes, that is, whosoever will, take the water of life without cost. One of the things that's so impressive in this passage in Isaiah 55 then is this water, this food and drink that the Lord offers it can't be bought. And you get it without money and without cost. It's by the grace of God, and we couldn't buy it ourselves if we tried. It's all by His grace. It's part of His provision. And that's part of the good news of the gospel. One of the things that we see very clearly in passages like Isaiah 55 is how many times the Lord appeals to the people to say to them, it's up to you to accept it. But you have to make a decision. It really is an invitation. There's something they must do, and it's full of imperatives. He says to them, you've got to come to the waters. He says in verse 2, listen carefully to me. In verse 3, incline your ear and come to me. Listen that you may live. In verse 6, he says, seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. In verse 7, you have to forsake your wicked ways. You've got to turn from them. Return to the Lord, he says in that verse, and he'll have compassion on you. And to God, and he will abundantly pardon. Everything that's said here just reminds us of what we know is true from reading the gospel. That it's salvation full and free. But there's still something we have to do. We have to be ready to accept it, to put ourselves at God's mercy, and come to him and say, there's nothing I can offer